So up next is talking about body planes and the way we can kind of divide the body into different sections. You don't have this picture on your student notes because I feel like it is really confusing to see them all there together as like one like big thing, but that is how they're often shown. So quite often they're put together in this way, and you really have to have like this spatial like 3D like mind to see what is happening. So I want to explain this image to you. This is similar to the one from the textbook, but then I found another one that I thought kind of helped a little bit. Okay, so sagittal, the sagittal plane, it's kind of this guy right here. He's a vertical plane, but the sagittal plane divides the body into a right and left-hand side. So, or an organ, right? We can divide organs with these planes as well. But we usually see them drawn and described for the first time, like talking about the whole body. So the sagittal plane divides the body into a right and left-hand side. Okay, if it's truly dividing the body in half, sometimes it is called the mid-sagittal or the median plane. Okay, so sagittal is just dividing into a right and left-hand side. If it's truly like the middle, like truly dividing into half, sometimes that's called sagittal, but sometimes people are more specific and they call it a mid-sagittal or a median plane. Okay, so if it's not quite dividing it into equal parts, sometimes it's called parasagittal or even longitudinal. What we need to know at this point really is to remember sagittal planes are dividing the body or an organ into left and right hand sides. All right, and then next we have the frontal plane. So it's kind of like this guy right here. The frontal plane, sometimes called the coronal plane, divides the body into a front and back, so an anterior and a posterior portion. Or it could be an organ as well. So frontal plane, also called the coronal plane, that's dividing the body or an organ into a front and back piece. So those are both vertical planes. So it's one's going this way, like the sagittal is going this way, like dividing our body into right and left. Frontal, still vertical, it's still standing up this way, just dividing my body into front and back. The third plane is horizontal. So that guy's going this direction. So the third plane, that's a horizontal plane. So the horizontal plane, we call it our transverse plane. So it divides the body or an organ into like a top, upper, and lower section. And then the transverse planes, we're actually going to see like a transverse plane a little bit later in our lecture, are called cross sections. So like we'll learn about the lungs, we'll learn about the heart, we'll learn about the ribs. But what's really weird, and it takes a while to learn to like to see these cross-sectional like pictures. It was one of the hardest things for me to really get the anatomy. We have to look at it like a cross-sectional, like where are the hearts in relationship, the heart in relationship to the lungs, in relationship to the ribs, in relationship to like the trachea, in relationship to like our aortic valve, and seeing all of these things at different like cross sections of the body. So we will see like a cross section in a little bit later to kind of show those things. All right, so hopefully that gave you time to get that written down again. Send me a message in chat if I'm going too fast. So sagittal plane divides the body into right and left. Frontal plane divides the body into front and back. Frontal plane is also called the coronal plane. Those are both vertical planes. And then the transverse plane divides the body into the top and bottom. So I liked this picture because it kind of just showed them like one plane at a time. So I liked that idea. So you could kind of see that. But I wanted you to see the other image as well, because that's quite often how they are put together. Okay, so body planes, that's one way we can kind of section up the body. Another way we can talk about sections of the body are in body cavities. So you don't have this exact image. Yours is coming up in a couple slides. This one was just nice because it kind of gave us a chance to introduce it. Oops. Okay, so another way we can kind of describe sections of the body is the body cavities. So first, let's talk about why we even have them. Like, why was this a design in our bodies to have it this way? Like, why is this how we have evolved? Having these cavities helps keep things where they belong, right? It kind of forces our internal organs to stay where they should and not let them just kind of float all around everywhere. It's one of the ways we help contain them and keep them where they actually belong. And sometimes cavities are created by bone. So it'll be like a bony structure, like bone is there to help create the cavity, like our cranial cavity we'll talk about in a second. That's surrounded by bone, right? That's keeping our brain where it belongs, not letting it go anywhere. But that cavity has like bone around it to help keep it there. Some of our other cavities, like our ventral cavities, like the abdominal cavity specifically, has just some like linings, some like visceral linings to help keep things where they belong. There might be like some ligaments there. There might be some other type of divider, like we'll talk about the diaphragm in a second. Those are just like tissues and things to help keep them kind of define these little areas to keep things where they belong. Okay, and then of course it's there to protect as well. The cavity is a protection. Our skull is there to protect our brain. So one of the most important organs. So it gets a very good protection of actual like bone, rather than just having, some tissues and some like fluid linings and things like that. It's there cavities exist to keep things where they belong and to help protect. So contain and protect. That's the whole point in having these cavities. We have two, like what we call main cavities, or like the major cavities. One is called the posterior, and we'll go through all of this in a second. And then the other is called the ventral. So dorsal, ventral, posterior, anterior. There are other cavities. So like our eye sockets, those are considered like cavities. Back in here we have like nasal cavities. Our mouth is considered a cavity. So we have other like cavities in our body. But what we're about to talk about are the two like main, like big cavities that help us with this. On here, it just made a quick note. One of the nice things about the ventral cavity, because it's not surrounded by bone, it does allow for like the organs to kind of move a little bit, to expand, like our lungs need to expand and contract, our stomach needs to expand sometimes. And so it allows for that to happen without like disrupting a lot of the other nearby organs. So if it was totally like bone there, and our stomach tried to expand, then we would be pushing into another organ spot. So that's one of the nice things about our ventral cavity not having bone, just having tissues there to help define it, is it allows for that movement to happen. Okay, so this is the picture you have. So let's dive in and help get it labeled a little bit better. So posterior or dorsal cavity has two main parts. It has the cranial cavity, which is where our brain is. And then it has the vertebral cavity, which is where our spine is. So our spinal cavity or vertebral cavity, that's where our spinal cord is. Okay, both of those are very well protected by bone because they are highly, highly important to our survival. Okay, so our brain controls a lot of the activity in our body, sending out those impulses through our nerves. The nerves carry down through the spinal cord and then out to other parts of the body. That's what tells our heart to keep pumping, our lungs to keep breathing. So those are, not to say other organs aren't important, but those are very, very important organs that we want to keep protected. So those two, we protect them with bone. Okay, now to help with our movement and to allow us to bend and flex and, side to side movements, things like that, our spinal cavity, or our, not spinal cavity, but our spine itself is made up of a whole bunch of little bones stacked on top of each other. So that's what allows us to bend. If it was one big solid bone, we wouldn't have that movement. We would only be able to like 90 degrees, like at the waist. So we wouldn't have like the little movements along the way or the side bends side to side. We may not have that without the way our spinal column is put together. Okay, so that's the dorsal cavity, just two parts to the dorsal cavity, but containing some pretty important pieces of information. So housing the brain and then the spinal cord. So the anterior or the ventral body cavity, so this guy over here, that can be divided into two main pieces. So the ventral body cavity, the one on our front, is divided into this purple. So that's called the thoracic cavity, which is then divided even smaller. We'll talk about that. So the thoracic cavity is this purple. And then the diaphragm is helping divide the two. So the thoracic cavity is kind of this upper chest part, like kind of think where our ribs are. So where you feel your ribs on the front of your body, that's like your thoracic cavity. And then we have our diaphragm. Yeah, it's like a tissue that's then dividing the thoracic cavity from the bottom cavity, and its name is abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic cavity. And of course, that cavity can then be divided into smaller parts. So again, we have the purple, the thoracic cavity, that's the top part. Think of where like our ribs are. So that's our thoracic cavity. And then the second is the abdominopelvic cavity. That's like the pink and green put together. Okay, so abdominopelvic cavity. And then it can be divided by the pink and green sections. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so just to review, we have dorsal cavity on our backside, which contains our brain and our spinal column. On the front side, we have the thoracic cavity, which is up here where our like ribs are. And then we have the abdominopelvic, which is the abdomen and the pelvic region. That's another cavity. And then both of those are subdivided even smaller. So then the thoracic cavity, oh, I said all that. Okay, so the thoracic cavity, basically, what I haven't covered yet, contains the lungs and the heart. It's kind of its whole, there's other things in there, but those are the kind of main things, main organs in there that we have. And then again, it's told us that the diaphragm is separating the two. So let's talk about in here these kind of other little areas. So the purple on here, what's labeled as purple, those are called the pleural cavity. So it's right here in the middle. It's called the pleural cavity. So those purple areas, that's basically where our lungs are going to be. So there's like fluid, like kind of fluidy sacs that surround the lung. So even though they're in this cavity altogether, they're in this thoracic cavity altogether, there's still fluid around the lungs to protect them from other stuff in this same cavity. So even though there's lots of stuff in this cavity, they're still individually protected as well. So there's like these fluidy sacs, and you'll see it in just a second. These sacs that kind of surround even the organs within that cavity. So these purple areas, that's the pleural cavity. And then what they have like orange and teal, that's really just kind of like one cavity. It's called the mediastinum. But even that cavity is divided into subcategories. So there's this superior mediastinum, has like our trachea, that's the kind of like our windpipe, has that in there, some other things. What we would kind of focus more on is the turquoise one. So it's the inferior mediastinum, also called the pericardial cavity, which is within the mediastinum. And that's surrounding our heart. So pericardial cavity is surrounding our heart. But again, there's this little like fluid sac around it to help protect it. And you're going to see it on our next cross-section slide in just a second. Okay, so thoracic cavity, like think about like our chest where our ribs are. You have the pleural cavities, which are the purple. That's where our lungs would be. We have the mediastinum here in the middle. One of the sections of the mediastinum is called the pericardial cavity, and that's where our heart is. And notice our heart, it's not like way over here on this left-hand side where everybody thinks it is. It's not truly like way up over here. It's a little bit more medial than most people like think about it. It is slightly left situated. Our right lung is bigger. Our right lung has what's called 3 lobes. Our left lung only has 2 major lobes, and that's to make room for the heart. So the heart is towards the left, but it's not like way over like on our shoulder like sometimes people like to think it is. So it is a little bit more centered than we tend to think so. Okay, so let's look at a cross section. This is of the thoracic cavity. So the gentleman right here, you can see the transverse plane. What I don't like is this picture, I feel like they flipped it around. So he's facing me, so this would be his anterior side. But if you look at the picture, the anterior side is kind of what's going away. So this is in the cross section, this kind of section right here, this is the anterior. This is the front of him. And then this is the posterior. So they've kind of like sliced through his body so we could see this this thoracic cavity, but kind of see where everything is kind of situated. And then it says this is an inferior view. So we're looking like up at his body. So see where this arrow is? It's like that's where we're looking up at him. So we can see it's labeled right here, this kind of pinky tissue, that's a lung. This is the other lung, this is the left lung. And it's hard to like see, but you can kind of see like this little like purple area in there, kind of in around here. That's the kind of sac that I was talking about that helps kind of protect what's going on there. So see right here, it's called the right pleural cavity. So that was like the purple picture over here. The pleural cavities were like these pictures over here. And then in that cavity, we're gonna have this kind of, this like serous liquid kind of protector. It's like a, I don't know, protective water balloon, for lack of a better kind of way to describe it. So it has kind of just this fluid in there that kind of helps protect it if it gets, you know, bumped or whatever, to help protect it. And then here's our heart. We would learn more about the heart, but notice it is kind of forward. It's towards the anterior part. And it's not truly way over here on the left-hand side. It is a little bit more medial. And this is his spinal column back here. You can see the little dots along the way over here, like ribs. The red out here, that's muscle. And then the yellowish color is the epithelial tissue or the skin. So again, you will not be quizzed on all these little pieces, but I just wanted you to see kind of what a cross-section looks like. We will be looking at these a lot to really see how organs are kind of related to each other. Okay, so let's finish with cavities. So then the abdominopelvic cavity, this kind of pink and green, that's really considered like one cavity. There's no dividing membrane between them, no tissues to divide them, but they house different pieces. So in the abdominal cavity, we get a lot of our digestive organs. In the pelvic cavity, we have a lot of our reproductive organs. So they house different organs, like they have different reasons for being there, but there is no like real membrane separating them. So we have the diaphragm separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. But there is no like real membrane separating the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. All right, so one more picture showing the different body cavities and what they do. Why are they there? What do they house? So you might want to jot some of this down if you haven't already. So cranial cavity, it's there to contain our brain. So it's formed by the cranial bones and it contains the brain. The vertebral canal, so that's our vertebral column made up by our vertebrae that contains our spinal cord. The thoracic cavity had the pleural cavity in there. That was like the purple. So that's the space and the layers of protection, the pleura, that surround the lungs. And we will talk more about that protective layer when we talk about the lungs. So we will get into more detail of what it looks like, what it does, all of that. I just wanted you to understand that the lungs and heart aren't just like floating around. They even have like little protections around each of them as well. Okay, and then we have the pericardial cavity, which is inside the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is kind of like the center area, media, middle. So it's between the pleural cavities. But the pericardial cavity is specific to our heart, right? It's keeping our heart safe. The mediastinum itself has other things in that area. So it has our thymus, our esophagus, our trachea, some major blood vessels. So it is, the mediastinum is kind of like the whole middle area. But remember, there was a special little section called the pericardial cavity, which is inside the mediastinum, and that houses our heart. And then the abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into the abdominal cavity, has our stomach, spleen, liver, gallbladder, intestines, small and large. And then it has that serous membrane I was talking about. Again, a lot more detail about it, but it has those kind of membranes in there that have like some fluids in them to help protect. So they're not totally just, you know, free for all. There are some protections in there to help kind of keep things where they belong and protect them. And then our pelvic cavity that has like our bladder. Some of the large intestines are back in the pelvic cavity, like a little, like the last part of the intestines. And then our internal reproductive organs would be back in the pelvic cavity. Okay, so again, we have these cavities in our bodies for a couple of reasons. One is to help maintain things where they should be, help contain them where they belong. And then another one is for protection. All right, the last slide I wanted to talk about today is our kind of abdominal pelvic cavity. Depending on what it is we want to like do, we may be dividing it into different quadrants. So the one on the right-hand side where we just have 4 quadrants, if we're not needing to be really like specific, we just name them right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, and left lower quadrant. So basically, if you took that abdominopelvic cavity and just like swoosh, swoosh, and divide it into 4 pieces, that kind of is how you divide, you would name it that way. So if we're not needing to be super specific about what we're talking about, we could just say right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower quadrants. If we're needing to be more specific in how we're talking about like a region and where something is, then we would use these nine regions. So depending on what we're learning, they might reference just a quadrant, just to give us like kind of a basic idea where it is. If they're wanting to be more specific, then they'll label it as these 9. So it's right hypochondriac region. So if there's a right hypochondriac, then there's going to be a left hypochondriac region. And then in the middle, we have epigastric region. Okay, so that's kind of our top 3. Right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, middle would be epigastric. And then in the middle section, we have right lumbar, which is referring to like a place on our spine. We'll learn about different sections of the spine. And kind of the section that's right here would be like our lumbar section. So it's the right lumbar region and the left lumbar region. And then right in the middle, we have our umbilical region, think belly button. And then the bottom 3, this bone right here that kind of makes like our pokey, like pelvis bone right there, it's called the iliac. This like upper part right here is called the iliac crest. So this kind of lower region, kind of down into like the pelvic area, where that bone is. So it'd be the right iliac region, because that's the name of this bone. And then left iliac region. And then hypogastric region in the middle. So we have epigastric, hypogastric, right and left for a lot of these. And then right in the middle, we have the umbilical region.